I have been a country solicitor for most of my working life, and I will tell you what that profession teaches you above all else: how to read a silence. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that falls between people who have nothing left to say to one another and are relieved about it, but the weight-bearing kind, the silence in a room when something has just been understood that cannot be taken back. I have sat across from widows when I have finished reading a will. I have watched a man's face when he learns what his father actually thought of him. I have heard the particular stillness that follows the closing of a folder. I had not, until that February evening at Havelock's, heard a silence made by music. The annual dinner of the Hartwell Benefactors Circle is not a gathering I attend for pleasure. I go because Mrs. Isabel Farwell attended it for 31 years before her death, and because it seemed to me that someone who had known her should be present when the chair she endowed was formally renamed in her memory. I had handled the Farwell estate since 1988. I knew the terms of Isabel's bequest as well as I knew my own signature. What I had not fully known, until that night, was the woman who had lived in her house. Dorothea Farwell, Dot, as Isabel always called her, had been Isabel's companion and housekeeper for 30 years. Not a servant in the formal sense. The arrangement had long since become something warmer and more complicated than employment, which is precisely the sort of thing a solicitor notices in a will and declines to remark upon. Dot was 73 years old and had the upright, unhurried manner of someone who had spent a lifetime moving through other people's houses with deliberate quiet. She wore a dark blue dress I suspected had been Isabel's. She had come to the dinner because the circle had asked her to accept a framed citation on Isabel's behalf, and she had accepted the invitation with the same composed attention she brought to everything, and sat at the end of the long table where the candlelight barely reached her. There were 40 of us, perhaps a few more. Havelock's has an Edwardian dining room, plasterwork ceiling, burgundy walls, a fireplace that actually burns in February, and a Bosendorfer grand in the corner alcove that I had never once heard played in 11 years of attending these dinners. It stands there the way certain pieces of furniture stand in a formal room, present and not to be touched. Sir Edmund Fallow had been elected chairman of the circle 3 years before Isabel's death, and he ran the dinners the way he had run his chambers, efficiently, with a pleasant conviction that the room existed in order to be organized by him. He is not an unkind man. He has endowed 2 hospital wings and a university prize in surgical oncology, and these are not nothing. But he has a particular way of addressing the people around the edges of a room, the waitstaff, the caretaker, the widow of a former chairman, that is not cruel and is not warm and is entirely habitual, the way a large, confident man moves through a space without quite registering all the things he does not disturb. The speeches were done. The citation had been presented. Dot had received it with a nod and a thank you that contained, I thought, a great deal more than those 2 words normally carry, and returned to her chair at the end of the table. It was then that Sir Edmund, turning from a conversation about an arts endowment with a woman from the county council, glanced toward the piano in the alcove, then toward Dot, and said, in the carrying voice of a man who does not think about the weight of rooms, "Mrs. Farwell, since we have an instrument and a moment, perhaps you'd care to play something soft to fill the quiet. Nothing elaborate, just a little background warmth while people settle." He had already turned back to his conversation before the sentence was finished. I watched Dot's face. I have been reading faces across tables for 40 years, and what I saw in hers in that moment was not hurt, and it was not surprise. It was something quieter than either, a kind of internal stilling, as if a decision that had been waiting a very long time had just been made for her by someone who had no idea they were making it. She set her napkin down. She rose from her chair with the same unhurried precision she had shown all evening. She crossed to the alcove, adjusted the bench with 2 turns of the knob. She did not look at her hands while she did it, and sat. The room went on talking. That is the nature of background warmth. You carry on. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, not at the keys but in her lap, fingers loosely interlaced, eyes lowered. I noticed it, because I have seen the same gesture in the minute before judgment is delivered. Then her hands came to the keys. The opening of Satie's Gymnopédie in D major is one of the most familiar things in the world of serious music. Familiar in the way a lane through a familiar wood is familiar, so that you do not think about each step, only about where it is taking you. Several people in the room, I suspect, recognized it in the first 4 bars and made the small, satisfied internal adjustment of the person whose expectation has been confirmed. Soft music, yes. Background warmth, yes, as requested. But Dot did not play it as background. She played it the way a person tells the truth after a long time of not telling it. Carefully, and without performance, and at a volume calibrated to be heard by every person in the room without being pressed upon any of them. Each chord had its full weight and its full patience. The melody moved above it with a plainness that had nothing spare in it, nothing removed, only the note, and the silence after the note, and then the next note arriving at exactly the right distance from the last. I cannot tell you when the room stopped talking. I can only tell you that by the time I noticed that it had been stopped for some time. The Gymnopédie ran its course, 2 minutes, perhaps 3, and I felt the small collective exhale of people preparing to return to their conversations. And then Dot did not stop. What came next was not Satie. It was a melody I had never heard in my life, and I felt, hearing it, that I had always known it was going to sound like this. It was in the same key, and it shared something of the Gymnopédie's unhurried pacing, but it was its own thing entirely, a nocturne of sorts, moving in a long, patient arc, the bass notes steady beneath it like a heartbeat or like water, and the melody above doing what a melody does when it has been inside someone for a very long time and is finally being let out, finding its way, opening phrase by phrase, without haste and without any sense that there was a destination other than the next note, and the one after that. The woman to my left, I do not know her name, she works, I believe, in cardiac research, lowered her fork onto her plate without looking at it. On my right, a retired circuit judge pressed 2 fingers briefly to his mouth. I kept my eyes on Dot. She played with her eyes closed. Her back was straight, her shoulders low, her face entirely still. Not the stillness of concentration, but the deeper stillness of someone who is not in Havelock's dining room at all, but somewhere else, somewhere a long time ago, in a room I had never seen but which I had been given to understand, in 7 years of annual dinners and 38 years of estate papers and 1 afternoon in Isabel Farwell's drawing room in November 2019, had contained a piano and 2 women and a summer that neither of them had spoken about to anyone else. The melody turned. It did not hurry. It moved through something that was almost loss and arrived somewhere that was not quite consolation, but was close enough to consolation that the distinction did not matter, and then it did something I have since tried to describe, and cannot quite. It gathered. It gathered the way light gathers in a room at a particular time of evening when you have not been paying attention, and you look up, and the quality of everything has changed. The bass notes came fuller. The right hand found an upper register I had not expected, and the phrase it played there was the simplest thing in the world. 8 notes, perhaps 10, and it crested, and it held, and then it came down, and down, and down, into the lowest stillness I have ever heard a piano reach. The last chord sustained for a long time. I have since tried to measure it in my memory, the way I measure other things, in seconds, in clauses, in the distance between one word and the next. I cannot. It was simply there, and then, by the smallest possible degree, it was not, and the room in its absence was not the same room it had been before. Dot lifted her hands from the keys and set them in her lap. For a moment, I counted, without thinking from professional habit. It was 4 seconds, possibly 5. No one in that room made a sound. Then the cardiac researcher to my left began to cry. She made no effort to conceal it, and no effort to explain it, and I think that was right, because there is nothing to explain when a thing of that quality has passed through a room. You are simply in it, or you are not, and we were all in it. The retired judge stood first, then the woman from the county council. Then, one by one, the entire length of the table, until 40 people were on their feet in an Edwardian dining room in February, and the only person seated was Sir Edmund Fallow, who was looking at Dot Farwell with an expression I had not seen on his face before, the expression of a man who has just understood, precisely and without softening, the difference between a room he has filled and a room that has been genuinely filled. He stood. He did not applaud. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched her, and his face had lost, for the moment, the comfortable authority it wore the rest of the evening. I was the last to sit back down. I am not a demonstrative man. I am a solicitor. I handle estates. I crossed to Dot when the room had settled. She had remained at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, accepting the quiet attention of the people who came to stand near her without quite knowing what to say. And I sat beside her on the bench, which was the only seat available, and I said nothing for a moment, and she allowed that, and then she said, "Isabel wrote the melody. The long middle part." She said it without looking at me. Her voice was even and very quiet. "We worked on it the summer before she died. She said she wanted it played somewhere, eventually, somewhere it could be heard properly." A pause. "She made me promise. She said I would know when." I asked her if Isabel had given it a name. Dot considered this for a moment, in the manner of someone recalling something precise. "She called it the same thing every time," she said. "She called it yours. I have drawn up a great many documents in my career. Wills, codicils, instruments of transfer, letters of administration. I have read out the last wishes of people who were not there to read them out themselves, and I have tried to do that with the weight and care the task deserves. I thought until that evening that I understood what it meant to keep faith with someone after they were gone. I understood it better after that night. I understand it better still now, when I think of Dot Farwell sitting alone at a piano in a drawing room for 30 years, playing it until she had it right, playing it until Isabel's melody and her own were truly a single thing, keeping the promise that no one else knew she was keeping, waiting for a room that would hear it properly. Sir Edmund did not speak to her that evening. He left early, as chairmen sometimes do, but I am told he wrote a letter to the Circle the following week, asking that the Bosendorfer at Havelocks be tuned quarterly and made available, at any time, to any member who wished to play. I do not know if Dot knows about the letter. I think she would find it characteristic of the man, in the best and most accurate sense, a practical response to something he did not have the language for. Some people, when they have been shown something true, can only do the next useful thing. I have no objection to that. It is not nothing. What I know is this. I have read the silences in rooms for 40 years, and I have learned to tell the difference between the kind that means something has ended and the kind that means something has, at last, been kept. That was the second kind.